Welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar on sanitary surveys, which is part of the EPA's monthly Small Systems webinar series. Before I begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the webinar website within a few weeks. So for those who can't make it or you want to watch this again, we will have a recording up. In the navigation bar on the right-hand side of your screen, a PDF copy of the slide has been provided under the handouts dropout. If you experience any audio issues or can't view the slides at any time during the webinar, you can let us know by typing in the questions box, drop-down box, also located on the navigation bar, or you can send an email or call GoToMeeting helpline, as you can see on the slide. We will have a Q&A session at the end of both talks today. At any point during the webinar, feel free to ask questions for the presenters by typing them in the questions drop box. We will do our best to respond to as many questions as possible. Brooke Porter from EPA's Office of Water will moderate the Q&A session. During the webinar, we will also post links and other information that's necessary on the chat drop box. Okay. And here are a few of the requirements to get the certificate. So you need to be at the live webinar. We cannot provide certificates for recordings. You must attend for 60 minutes. And anybody who is in the room with you, if you could just put that number in the questions box so we can get an idea of everyone who is attending, that would be great. All right. And we also do have a few webinars coming up. So we have a few drinking water trainings, and there's 2 tomorrow. And then July 25th, we have the Chemical Contaminant Rule Part 3, waivers and reporting and record keepings. We also have another Small Systems on July 30th on Legionella and premise plumbing in buildings. And on July 24th, we will be discussing our early detection of algal blooms in U.S. freshwater systems, the Cyan mobile application. And I would like to put in a little plug about the workshop. So it's the 16th annual EPA Drinking Water Workshop. It's on September 24th through the 26th, and it's at the Duke Energy Convention Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. This workshop will focus on drinking water distribution monitoring and treatment topics. It will also have discussion groups, ask the experts, and it is a great networking event. So if you're interested, register at the link provided on the slide. Okay, and here is our disclaimer. Oh, sorry, I think someone's typing. Yeah. All right, and so before we get, let's see. Our first speaker today is Lucio Trinidad. Lucio is the chief of the field inspection section in the Drinking Water Branch, Office of Water Quality at Indiana Department of Environmental Management, and has been a drinking water field inspector for 16 years. He will discuss what to expect during your next sanitary survey. Thank you for joining us today, Lucio. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, everyone. And appreciate the opportunity to speak today. And if there are any questions later on, if you want to email or call me, you're welcome to do so. I'll be glad to answer any questions or discuss any further what you see and hear today. So, so I have been doing field inspections for some time. Now I oversee the field inspectors in the state of Indiana, and I try to help them figure out what is it that Indiana wants to do with its inspection program and trying to standardize that process. I have been able to, with the collaboration of the Region 5 EPA folks and headquarters, to provide a 3.5-day sanitary survey training to a lot of our staff here in the drinking water branch. And we had that last week. So that went really well. Really appreciate the EPA folks helping out. And we were able to visit a surface water plant and a groundwater under the direct influence of surface water plant in the process of that training. So so this talk particularly, I wanted to discuss just the process and just touch base on the 8 elements of a sanitary survey. States are tasked with the requirement of inspecting facilities and they have to meet EPA's requirements of the 8 elements. And we have thrown a couple on there at the end with the intent to help operators and municipalities and public water supplies further develop their treatment plants and water systems. So just a little bit of perspective. We are tracking deficiencies, and I apologize, these numbers are outdated, and I didn't realize I did not have the right ones here, but these numbers are from April, and I have new numbers with me now, but we keep track of these in an effort to help water systems complete their upgrades or fix deficiencies. So for minor deficiencies, as of today, we're up to about 905 minor deficiencies in each of the survey categories. And then for significant deficiencies, we're up to 153 deficiencies that we are tracking, and we'll be following up with water systems to make sure that they correct them. So basically, as a field inspector, you're visiting a facility and you're making contact with the operator, and as you walk up to the well house or the pumping facility, you're striking a conversation and you're developing that rapport. In Indiana, we make appointments to go visit them, but we can just show up if we want to. Most of the time, we're able to make appointments and meet with the right person. That way, we're getting the correct information. In the process, walking up to the pumping facility, we're scoping the facility out, looking at the roof and different aspects of what we're looking at. We're looking for any problems that might be happening on the outside, any security issues. Once we open the door and we're looking inside, we're surveying the area and thus beginning our source inspection. We're looking at each of the components of the pumping facility. This is a small municipal water system. So each of the facilities, we're discussing with the operator any issues that they might have had with this well or any others, any of their source water aspects. As an inspector, you're providing a second set of eyes. Maybe you see something obvious and you point out to the operator, and they realize that, oh, I didn't know that this was happening. And you'd think, boy, this is obvious. You're leaking oil all over the place. How did you not know this? So that's a very good opportunity for you to approach the operator and really, drive home the point of you need to be looking at your infrastructure. You need to be visiting these facilities, especially if they are remote, because if you don't have a good electronic surveillance, then you don't know what's happening out there. So as an inspector, you're looking at these components. In this particular one, it looked like the oil was leaking onto the pad, and actually the food grade oil was actually getting into the well casing and being pumped into the aerator and clear well and through into the filters. So that was a significant problem that the operator didn't realize was happening, although there were gallons of oil in the pump house. So we had a conversation about that. But you're looking at all the components in the system, make sure that no obvious leaking or problems are occurring. Now, we also visit a lot of small systems, and sometimes we get to some real obvious ones, but for the most part, inspectors are looking at restaurants and schools and factories and churches and so on. So we come through and we see a lot of these types of examples, and we're able to talk to the owners about potential problems that they could encounter if this continues. So, either you're using too much weed control around the well, want to not do that, and some flooding concerns and some potential problems with insects and so on entering the casing. But source water is very important for us to consider, and being the first layer of defense, selecting a good site and protecting that water source. Just a couple of other examples here with physical damage in parking lots and so on, or pooling water around the well, and maybe some outdated equipment that the well cap there, could potentially be upgraded to something that would allow for better sealing around the well. So moving on to water treatment facilities, there are all types of sizes and shapes and varieties. And as an inspector, you have to be aware that, maybe it'll take you a long time to see everything, but a lot of things are common, and you need to take note. So we're looking at the facility, what does it look like? And again, walking around the building, surveying the site and so on, and looking at auxiliary power and talking to the operator how they operate that. One operator said, "Oh yeah, we got a new generator," and I asked, so are the wells connected? "Oh no, it powers the plant." "Okay, so how are you going to provide water to the system?" "Oh, we forgot about the well." So that's not helpful. So it provides with just another set of eyes, or someone else asking some questions. Now you can walk into the treatment plant, and you're talking to the operator, and explain to me what's happening here. Not that you don't know what's happening, but it may be your first time, or you're not familiar with something, but you want to let them know that you're looking at each component, and the operator generally will be very proud of the work that they do at the plant. So they will be quick to give you a tour and talk about the great things that they have done and what they do there. So you, as the inspector, are looking, and the regulator are looking at each of the components, taking your notes and taking your pictures, and looking for potential issues that might exist, with an idea of potential pathways of contamination into the water system. So you're surveying, filter discharges. Are they meeting basic standards with air gaps and cross connections and so on? The feed equipment and liquid, and you talk to the operator about, spill management and control and safety data sheets, and you're looking for any issues with the tanks, and just really being critical about what is going on there. And this one on the right is a facility where they make sodium hypochlorite on site. So you talk about that, what kind of maintenance does that take? How often is that down? Do you have to take that apart ever? And so you find out, if they are actually doing all the maintenance. Depending on the water system and the facility and the treatment that they have there, in this case, we have some pressure filters, horizontal systems here. And you want to walk around all of the filters. You're noticing the cells and maybe pipe colors, and you talk to the operator on how does it work and how often, and you're just really quizzing the operator, one, to make sure that they are aware, but also you're talking and conversing and developing a relationship, a working relationship. So now these particular vessels will have air relief valves. You want to check the discharge, make sure that those are screened and have air gaps on them as well. So they should have rows and rows of screens around because everything will need a screen. On the right side there, we have some high service pumps, and you want to look at each pump and talk to the operator. You know, when do you take these offline, and do you maintain them, or do you just wait until they break down to fix things? So is there a process or a maintenance operation and maintenance that they go through and that they're watching to prevent breakdowns, and so that the water is flowing at all times. Now, a very important room in the water plant, of course, is a chlorine room, where there is quite obvious, you know, a gas hazard in this case. But you also want to look at all the chemicals and how they handle the chemicals, and are they separated appropriately, or are they together? You know, where are they stored, and what kind of situation that the whether it's dry chemicals and the bags and such. So in this case, we have some issues here in the middle with the chain being off like that. As the EPA trainer said, you just back away and walk out of the room. That is quite a hazard there if that tank tips over for any reason. And that scale seems like it's seen its better days. But you want to make sure that the venting is working before you enter the room. You can, you know, turn the lights on, verify the fans are going, and then you sort of survey the area around the outside of the chlorine room. You know, you talk to the operator about some issues or tank changing procedures and things like that, just so that you can give it a little time to get that air exchange in the room. Make sure that tanks are properly secured on the wall, and any of the vents are facing down and screened. We have had some issues where the tubing in the vent, that the vents outside, it collects a little gas chlorine, and it will pick up some moisture from the outside and combine with the gas and make acid inside that tubing. So then when you replace the tubing, you have acid that then can get spilled or get on your skin and so on. So we want to recommend that those vent tubes are running downward with a downward angle and towards the ground outside, about 18 to 24 inches from the floor or the ground, so we don't collect any water in there. Signage is important. It tells people if they're approaching the room that that is a potential danger inside. So when all those things you want to talk to the operator about. As you continue to tour the plant, you want to look at where are they sampling. In this particular location, they have several types of faucets where they can collect good samples throughout the process, all the way from the raw to the finished. And you can see there in this groundwater plant where the red tinge on the tubing is indicative of the raw water. And as it goes through the process, it's removed and it gets clear. So you want to look at the equipment within the facility and the laboratory equipment, and make sure that they're calibrating the instruments and that the reagents are up to date. And if they are expired, that's a problem. And then you just, talk to the operator about the sampling. Where are they sampling? Is it a state-approved location? And all those types of things. Now, around a treatment plant, there are other aspects of things. There may be some abandoned wells. We want to verify that those are no longer a potential problem to the aquifer. So I want to make sure that those are capped and abandoned properly. They may sell water to other facilities or to pool contractors or construction contractors. So I want to make sure that they have proper equipment. You want to meter the water so that they can account for it. And also, you want to make sure that they have a backflow preventer that is tested and working properly so that they don't pose a potential cross-connection hazard at the water plant. A lot of systems now, even smaller systems, are able to provide some sort of electronic surveillance or a SCADA system, and that tells them what's happening, throughout their plant. And these are very, very beneficial for them to know what's happening, and they have a lot of control, and they can set up alarms, and it's really useful. They can get into it remotely if they need to from home and so on. But you also want to talk to them about security and cybersecurity, and make sure that they have appropriate safeguards in place to prevent any hacking or electronic problems, so that they don't lose control of their water plant. In some small water systems, the treatment that we may encounter, it may be as simple as a water softener or an inline filter, and so you want to talk to them that about the potential hazards that can occur if they don't operate those treatment devices appropriately. Here we have, of course, the softener is allowed to regenerate without any salt. So and you can see some insects in there. So that could be a problem that could introduce potential bacteria into the water system when you regenerate without any salt. The filter is pretty well full of iron in this case, and if they're lucky if they're getting any water running through there, but you want to talk to them about any maintenance and replacement of these filters to make sure there's a good control of the iron or sediment, but also it's not harboring any bacteria when they're this dirty. This tank, softener tank, has salt, but it also has mouse droppings. So you want to look into the salt tank and make sure that you don't have any extra things in there that could be a problem. On the bottom right, we have some pictures of this furnace room where the softener is located. It's also used as storage, and they have these Ziploc bags with ant killer and poison on them. So that's a clear indication that they really don't understand, what that room's about and what that salt tank does, and so on. So there's a lot of education that has to go on by an inspector at a facility when they're on site. Talking to municipal systems and their distribution system, we'll have another talk later today here about distribution systems, but you want to have a conversation about cross-connection control, and are they paying attention to that? Do they allow people to connect and get some water? In this case, we've got a tanker that's connected without any sort of backflow into it, and it's likely that the hose is just plopped into the tank, providing a hazardous condition there. Operators should be looking at flushing their systems appropriately to make sure they don't have areas in the distribution system where you have so much sediment, and if you never flush and then you flush, you might get this sort of water. But if you employ an appropriate flushing program, then overall, I think water quality is increased, and there's lots of studies with that would support that. Aging infrastructure, of course, is always an issue, and in this town, unfortunately, is no different. Major blowout at an intersection, and a major headache for these guys. But at small systems, they have a distribution system just the same, a lot of smaller, of course, but a lot of the same issues can arise. You know, it can have a potential of cross connections or systems that, if inappropriately connected, could contribute to water quality problems and risks that can come from it. Water systems and their finished water storage tanks. We have municipal systems with water towers of varying kinds and sizes and types, and small systems with bladder tanks and so on. But you know, they serve an important purpose, and the inspector should discuss these issues with the operator. You know, how are they using the towers, and how does the system work? Are you on the same pressure zones or separate pressure zones, and which controls what, and are they maintaining appropriately, and do they go into the tanks, or do they take them down and look inside, and you know, what kind of maintenance is going on? A lot of issues, you know, water towers often are neglected because it's an expensive proposition on top of everything else. So if you have safeguards in place, is it locked to prevent anybody from climbing? So, you know, the feet and the concrete pads, are they in good shape, or has weather been an issue that they need to address? All these things are opportunities for you to discuss with the operator, who many times will say, you know, we just don't have the money. You know, the board just don't want to give us the money. And so we can use the inspection report at the end then to provide a tool for the operator to try to convince the board or the town president that, you know, we need to inspect our towers and provide some repairs. Finished water storage and screens overflows are notorious for allowing for potential hazards to enter the tank, because if the screens are damaged or removed or blown out, then it's a direct path from the ground up into the tank. So we recommend that systems install 24 mesh and also 4 mesh for structural support, and that they check these screens often. And you know, the fact that they had the screens last year or the last time you inspected them doesn't mean that the screens will be there now. So we also want to look at the grading around the tank to make sure that the water isn't allowed to pool around the structure, because over time with weather you could have some issues there. So, and then this bottom right screen, there's a water bottle in there and some other debris that, however, that was allowed to enter the tank, but you know, possibly contractors were working in the tank, left it behind, or some other way, or got thrown in there. But potential problems can always arise. So screens are important. You know, we can have animals entering the tank for one reason or another, and the top of the tanks are particularly difficult for people that don't climb the tanks. You know, in Indiana, inspectors are not allowed to climb the tanks, so we have to rely on the operator and the municipal system to inspect the tanks often and verify that screens are in place to prevent any issues from arising or birds entering the system. So in the bottom right there is some feathers and some other things that come out of the overflow. But yeah, maintenance is important. Water towers are an important component of the water system, and if left unchecked, it can be catastrophe in a way of the municipal system losing its ability to control pressure and have fire protection and other reasons. In small systems, storage tanks play a important role as well because it provides pressure in the system, and if they lose pressure, same problems can occur. It can introduce bacteria and potential hazard. You can allow for backflow and back siphonage to occur and cause serious problems, introducing bacteria and potential sickness. So I want to make sure that tanks are inspected and replaced appropriately, and inspectors are on the lookout for any of these problems. Another component of the water system, of course, pumping facilities with booster stations and booster facilities to provide for water supply farther into the system. So these are facilities that need to be inspected often as well. A lot of these are in remote locations. Inspectors are taking note of how many pumps and gallons per minute and how are they designed within the system, and what pump comes on in relation to demand. I will click on the and I'll show again next time. So inspectors will walk around and check on these pumps a lot, similarly to the high service pumps. But we need to discuss this with the operator. And in Indiana, having a booster station makes it a more complex distribution system. So it does take additional certification and higher certification to have a system with a booster pump. A lot of what an operator goes through is the monitoring and reporting and that data where they're sampling and the paperwork, right? A lot of operators like to be out in the system, in the holes, fixing things, but equally important is the time spent in the office, getting all that straight and provided to the regulating community and showing us that their water system is operating properly. So any sampling, monthly reports of operation, well logs, and so on. So when you go on site and you walk up to the operator and they say, you know what, here's all my stuff, go at it. That's really good because they have what we need to look at. A lot of times we'll send an operator a checklist of things that we're going to be looking at and questions that we're going to be asking, because we don't want to spend too much time fiddling in files or trying to add, do some math and so on site. So we want to make sure that the operator is aware with what's happening and what's required of him. So, we're going to look at operation and maintenance and talk to them how they operate and how they maintain their equipment. Do they not have any records to show? And because serving, memory is only good for so long, and then it all blends together. So do they have replacement parts and enough storage to be able to make repairs quickly? Flushing programs and backflow prevention ordinances and programs, site sampling plans. Inspectors in Indiana review those on site with the operator to make sure that they have adequate site sampling plans for the RTCR. We discussed all these issues with lead and copper and contacts and so on. We verify the operators are properly certified, or if the facility doesn't have an operator for one reason or another, they retired or they are no longer at the facility, that's an issue that we have to discuss with them and notify the town that they're now out of compliance. This month, in a few days, we're about to decertify several hundred operators who have failed to acquire their continuing hours. I shouldn't say decertify, but their certifications will expire. So we're talking about 500 or 600 operators in the state of Indiana whose licenses will be expired on the 30th. So that's a major problem that we're going to need to deal with in the next few months, trying to get these operators the proper hours and explain to them that it's important. We discussed with the operators and systems in emergency response plans and how they can handle emergencies. It's a little different than their wellhead protection plan emergency section, but how will they continue to operate or provide continuous supply of water, through an emergency? Auxiliary power, redundancies, and so on are great, but do you have, beyond that, do you have contracts with outside vendors or other utilities that you can call on to help with that process? How do you handle a spill within your wellhead protection area? Do you exercise that? Do you have tabletop exercises that you're a part of? And if you hear about it as an operator, you should participate in those, because it is a community-wide problem. If some catastrophe happens, water continuance is very important. Touched a little on cybersecurity. That's up and coming topic more and more these days, but a lot of these operators are, old timers. They're not really good with computers. So that's something that they really need to take to heart and start looking into if they have some sort of computer-based system. In Indiana, we send a report after the inspection. Of course, we want them to fix the things that we identify on site, but so we give them a report with an itemized list of what is it that they'll need to do, and we'll follow up with them in hopes to correct all the deficiencies that they are identified. Thank you. I just had 3.5 days of training on this very issue. It takes hours to conduct an inspection, and we just flew by it in just over 30 minutes. So if there are any questions, any issues, or if you want to talk more about how we do it, what we do in the state of Indiana, I'll be glad to do so. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lucio. Before I introduce our next presenter, just a couple of reminders. For those who joined late, if you have more than one person in the room with you, please be sure to put the number of people in the room with you in the question box. Thank you. We will have a Q&A session at the end of both talks. At any point during the webinar, feel free to ask questions for the presenters by typing them into the question box. We will do our best to respond to as many questions as possible. So our second speaker for today is Deborah Vax-Renwick. Deborah is an environmental engineer with EPA's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. Her presentation will provide information to discuss distribution system infrastructure deterioration and its potential links to water quality and public health. I will now hand it over to Deborah.
Great, thank you very much. This presentation is going to focus on distribution system infrastructure and deterioration and how that can lead to public health issues. And a lot of the information that I'm going to be talking about in this presentation can also be found in a journal article that my colleagues and I recently published in February in the Journal of American Water Works Association. So a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about in these 30 minutes, if you're interested in learning more about them, I would point you to this article. And there's also going to be lots of references throughout the presentation for further reading. So when we talk about deteriorating distribution system infrastructure, one thing I want to point out here is that oftentimes deteriorating infrastructure and aging infrastructure gets spoken about as if they're the same thing, but we want to make a distinction here that there could be infrastructure that is very old but is very well maintained and so is not deteriorated, and on the flip side there could be infrastructure that is relatively new but has not been maintained well or has some other issues and is deteriorated. And so this slide here just shows that deteriorating distribution system infrastructure can affect a lot of different aspects of the water system. So there can be service disruptions, increased maintenance costs, increasing energy costs, water loss, flooding damage. But for this presentation and this project, we focused in on the water quality and public health effects. So in order to understand this problem a little bit better, my colleagues and I came up with this conceptual framework. So what this does basically is just break down this issue into three separate pieces. And so the first piece is the contamination mechanisms. So how are contaminants entering or possibly increasing in the distribution system? And how does infrastructure deterioration affect those contamination mechanisms? Second, the infrastructure conditions themselves. What types of deterioration make the system more vulnerable to contamination? And finally, waterborne disease. So how does the infrastructure deterioration affect the contamination mechanisms and possibly lead to waterborne disease? And so that's the conceptual framework for the bigger project. And then for this presentation, we're talking about sanitary surveys. So sanitary surveys fit in as a way to, to identify the infrastructure conditions, obviously, like Lucio was talking about, but then also to talk about how the system might be more vulnerable to different contamination mechanisms. And so these are the 8 sanitary survey elements that Lucio talked about, and I'm focusing here on the distribution system element, the finished water storage element, and the pumps element. But then also the management and operation element is also important, as we'll see. So first, what do we mean by contamination mechanisms? This is basically our way of saying, how do contaminants get into a distribution system, or how do they grow inside the distribution system? And so these are the ones that we've identified as being possibly the most linked to distribution system infrastructure deterioration. So we have intrusion, which is kind of the most direct mechanism where contaminants get into the distribution system from the outside, either through a hole in a finished water storage tank, or if there's a main break and that coincides with the loss in pressure, contaminants could enter the system. Next is biofilms and sediments, and so this is buildup of organic matter on the inside of the pipes or inside the tanks, and this is an issue in and of itself, but also these sediments and the biofilms can harbor microbes that can affect water quality and also contribute to other forms of deterioration. Next, corrosion. This is oxidation of any metal materials, so in pipes or tanks or other appurtenances, and this can lead to holes in the system, which can lead to more contamination. And then, as we're all familiar with, if you have a lead service line or other lead materials, the corrosion can cause lead to enter into the system. Next one we have here is high water age. This one is, if you have water that is sitting for an excessive amount of time, you can lose your disinfectant residual. You can, which makes your water more vulnerable to microbes and other things. It can also increase your disinfection byproducts as the water ages. It can also increase your biofilm and sediment buildup. Next, we have permeation, and so this is when chemicals pass directly from outside the distribution system through the material itself, so not because of a hole or anything, but because of possibly maybe a plastic pipe that is permeable to gasoline or other things can pass through it. This can also result in premature aging of these pipes as these chemicals pass through. Next is leaching. Leaching is it's similar to permeation, except that the contaminant is present in the distribution system material itself. And so this lead is the classic example of this, that if you don't have proper corrosion control, the lead that is in the pipe can leach directly into the water. And the thing about these contamination mechanisms is that they don't exist in a vacuum. They don't, they're not completely by themselves. They all affect one another. So this slide is a little bit complicated, but the main point here is that all of these things can affect each other. So for example, starting with corrosion, if a pipe is corroded, it may have a break in it, and that may lead to contaminant intrusion. If you have high water age, you may increase your biofilm and sediment growth. If you have lots of biofilm and sediment growth, you could host microbes that could actually increase your corrosion. The flip side also is that if you have corrosion, you may have some iron particles that are released that act as the food for the biofilms and sediments. Let's see, another one, water age. As the water ages, it can lead to less dilution of leached contaminants, excuse me. So if you have a pipe that is leaching material and the water is sitting for a long time, a higher concentration of that contaminant could build up. And both leaching and permeation could weaken the pipe itself, making a breach more likely, which could in turn lead to more intrusion. And the thing also to point out here is that these are just these are the examples that we have picked as the contamination mechanisms that are most likely to be affected by deterioration of infrastructure, but there are other ways that contaminants can enter the system. But these are the ones that we think the infrastructure deterioration could have the most effect on. So now we're going to go through the infrastructure conditions and how they relate to these different contamination mechanisms. So infrastructure conditions. One question we were trying to answer with this project is how do the different distribution system components deteriorate? What's happening to a pipe as it deteriorates will be different than what happens to a pump or to a storage tank. And then also, how does the deterioration influence the different contamination mechanisms? And vice versa, how does the contamination mechanisms influence the infrastructure deterioration? And so this graphic that I am showing here is just showing the Drinking Water Infrastructure Needs Survey and Assessment, which is a national survey that is done by EPA. And this is where systems are asked, what are your infrastructure replacement needs in terms of dollars? And so all of these are standardized into 2015 dollars here. And so you can see that as time has gone on from 1995 to 2015, more and more needs have been identified, and especially in the distribution transmission category, which is the blue, and in the storage category, which is the yellow. And so both of those are part of the distribution system. So for this study, we've divided up infrastructure in the distribution system into 4 main categories. So we have pipes, valves, storage tanks, and then pumps and other appurtenances. And that's where we're throwing in meters, fire hydrants, other regulating stations, possibly, things like that. And so we found that the different components are vulnerable to different contamination mechanisms, as you would expect. Starting out with pipes. So pipes are by far the largest part of a distribution system in terms of miles and just the amount of material that you have. It's mostly pipes. And so there's estimated that there's more than 1 million miles of drinking water distribution system piping in the US. And depending on what kind of pipe it is and what kind of environment it's placed in, the useful life can range from 50 years to 135 years. And we found that different studies have found that older pipes are more susceptible to biofilms and also to corrosion-related failures. And so over time, as pipes are used, they become fatigued, and this leads to more pipe failures, which main breaks. This graphic here shows the projected annual replacement needs for transmission lines and distribution mains. And so I just want to show here that on the y-axis, we're looking at what percentage of pipes are projected to need replacement in order to keep systems running. And you'll see that it peaks here in about 15 years in 2035 at 2% replacement. And this is what is projected to be needed. And we know that from surveys that overall systems are not replacing at a level at this percentage in order to keep all of the pipes in their system at a reasonable age for the life of the pipe. So the biggest, the most dramatic deterioration that can happen with pipes is pipe failures, so a main break. And this picture actually, this is taken right outside of the EPA headquarters building in February, where there was a big pipe break. And so you can see the flooding. You can see that it's like worn out the ground underneath this this planter, and that's actually fallen in. It was a big flood all over the street, and it's estimated that there's around 250,000 to 300,000 main breaks per year in the U.S. And there was a survey of almost 200 North American utilities that found that when a main failed, the average age was 47 years. So that is that's indicating that as your main gets older, as your pipes get older, your pipe breaks might be even more likely. And the reason, one reason we care about main breaks in particular is that this can be a factor leading to intrusion. So obviously when the main breaks, there is a hole in the main, and as you are repairing it, there could be a possibility for contamination, but also there could be low pressure caused in other parts of the distribution system nearby. And so that any small holes, maybe small leaks that have gone undetected, once the pressure goes down, contaminants could be entering into the system. The other issue that comes up with main breaks is biofilm. So when the main breaks, there's usually a big flow increase or flow direction reversal in the pipes, and so that can disturb the biofilms that have grown up on the inside of the pipes and could possibly release contaminants into the system. And so this is related to what Lucio was talking about earlier, that a good flushing program is something that can help you contain this kind of problem. Next, talking about valves. And so obviously the picture here, this is a deteriorated valve, not in the system anymore. And valves, because they're metal, they're susceptible to corrosion, or if they're metal, I should say. And they also have lots of opportunities for intrusion, same as pipes, that they can break, they can have holes in it. Between the fittings, there could be breaches where contaminants can come through. Another issue that's particular to valves is that if they're not operated regularly, they can become stuck open or stuck closed, which can create some dead zones or some high water age areas, which can lead to further water quality issues. And I mentioned the valve operation because at least in one survey from 2002, 64% of utilities reported operating at least some of their distribution system valves as part of an exercising program. However, only less than half of the large valves and only about a third of the small valves were reported as being operated each year. So this is something, this is a operations and maintenance program that can help prevent some of the issues that we see with stuck valves. Next, storage facilities. So Lucio had some great pictures of deteriorated storage tanks and tanks that are susceptible to contamination. This is no judgment on this tank. This is just a picture of a tank that I took on a road trip. But these tanks, if they're metal, they are susceptible to corrosion. They also are, almost by definition, they're a dead zone. They're an area where water is not flowing as quickly as they are in the pipes, and so you can have high water age issues. There also could be issues with biofilms building up on the inside of the tanks or the bottom of the tanks. And particular to tanks is the issue that they're generally not pressurized. If there is a hole in the top of the tank, anything can get in. There doesn't need to be a drop in pressure to allow contaminants to enter. And there's been two very well-known waterborne disease outbreaks that were ultimately traced back to storage facility contamination. So one was in Gideon, Missouri in 1993, and another in Alamosa, Colorado in 2008. And in both of these cases, the contaminant identified was salmonella, and many people got sick, and several people died as a result of these outbreaks. And I will point out that these two systems both were unchlorinated systems, so that was definitely a factor in allowing the contaminant to spread, but the contaminant entered the systems themselves through the storage tanks. Finally, pumps and other appurtenances. So pumps have a unique issue in that if they break down, that can lead to loss of pressure in the system. And if the system is depressurized, that means that instead of water flowing out of small holes in pipes, it's possible that outside groundwater or rainwater or other things can flow in. And there was one study that observed several different water utilities and saw 15, just while they were observing, saw 15 transient pressure events that resulted in negative pressure. And so not just low pressure, but negative pressure. And a lot of these were caused by sudden pump shutdowns. And so this is something that in the sanitary survey, if you're looking at if you have backup generators and you have a system in place to prevent pump shutdowns, this can help prevent these kind of issues. Another thing, meter boxes can be another entry point for intrusion, especially because meter boxes, if they're below grade on the sidewalk, they can be filled with water, and so any small, and so that water, if there's any drop in pressure or if the water is high enough above the meter box, it can lead all of that runoff to enter into the meter. And again, as with everything, anything that's metal could be vulnerable to corrosion, and which could lead to breaches, which could lead to all of these other issues that we're discussing. So finally, waterborne disease and deteriorating infrastructure. And so this was the final part of the conceptual framework. And so how do all of these things, the infrastructure deterioration and the vulnerability to contamination mechanisms, how are these leading to waterborne disease and public health concerns? And this one was one of the areas in the project that was the most complex and kind of the most difficult to quantify on a national scale. And so there's different ways of determining the level of waterborne disease that you might have in a system or across the country. The first is waterborne disease outbreaks. And so that's something that CDC tracks. And between 1981 and 2010, 57 waterborne disease outbreaks were identified specifically related to distribution system deficiencies. And this graph on the right shows the types of distribution system deficiencies that were identified in connection with these outbreaks. So you can see a big one is cross connections, making sure that you don't have pipes connected to other pipes where non-potable water can flow through. Another one was water main breaks. And this is separate from the water main repair, which is interesting. So there could be contamination occurring with the break itself, but then also when you're trying to fix the break, you have to be sure that you're not allowing contaminants to enter the system through that process. Another area was leaching of contaminants from the distribution system materials themselves. Another area was storage, kind of generally, which could be breaches in the storage tank, but also possibly biofilms and other things related to storage. And then finally, pressure fluctuation by itself was identified in 1% of these outbreaks. So beyond outbreaks, there's also epidemiological studies, which epidemiological studies are different from outbreak reports in that they look at a specific system or a group of systems and actually go out and try to find waterborne disease. They don't, they don't wait until something is reported to a public health official. This is trying to find disease, but also just kind of general gastrointestinal illness. And so several of these studies have found increases in illness associated with pressure losses, with main breaks, and with increased water age. And then finally, another way to track waterborne disease is models and estimates. And so this models and estimates try to capture anything, if we're seeing this many waterborne disease outbreaks, is there other waterborne disease that is being maybe unreported or incorrectly attributed? And so these models try to take all the available data and make an estimate. And so because these are models and estimates, they're not as precise as an epidemiological study. There's some uncertainty, there's a wide range of results, but there are some models that try to estimate how much of the waterborne disease that's out there can be attributed to distribution systems. Where we try to connect the dots a little bit further is within those that amount of disease that's caused by that might be caused by distribution systems, how much can be attributed to infrastructure deterioration specifically, and not to just some kind of operation mistake or other kind of contamination that occurs that would occur regardless of the state of the infrastructure. And I'll point out here, so there's a lot of references for this slide in particular. There's a whole slide at the end that has all of the articles cited on this topic. So there's a lot of remaining uncertainties between the connection between contamination mechanisms, infrastructure conditions, and waterborne disease. And so just to give you some examples of the kind of things that we're still trying to research and get a better idea of, for infrastructure conditions, there's a need for more data on the current infrastructure conditions. We have data from sanitary surveys, but that, as Lucio talked about, looks at deficiencies specifically. And so we don't know, there might be systems that are in poor condition, but don't quite make it to the level of a deficiency. Another thing that we don't have a lot of data on is how do the different maintenance practices affect the rate of system deterioration? So where, those systems that are very old but in very good condition, what are they doing on a national level? How can we compare between these systems? What are those well-maintained systems doing that are keeping their infrastructure in good condition? For contamination mechanisms, all of these contamination mechanisms that we've talked about are possible to that they could occur under the right conditions, but we don't really know how often they're occurring, especially on a national level. And when they do occur, how severely are they impacting water quality? Because there could be cases where water is from the outside is entering the distribution system, but it doesn't contain contaminants at a level to cause any waterborne disease. So what is the likelihood that if you have a deteriorated pipe, and what's the likelihood with a deteriorated pipe that you would have intrusion? If you have intrusion, what's the likelihood that you would have contaminants entering? If you have contaminants entering, what's the likelihood that you will have people getting sick? And the other question we have is that at the system level, as the system ages, do we see the possibility for these contamination mechanisms? Do we see them actually increasing? Or are they possibly not increasing in frequency, but increasing in severity? And finally, for waterborne disease, there's a need for some studies looking specifically at this infrastructure condition and in the relationship to public health, and how to prioritize infrastructure replacement or maintenance in terms of public health, and not just in terms of system reliability, which is also important, but how if systems have to make a choice or they're looking at their annual budget, what are the things that they could be doing that would specifically best influence public health and water quality. So finally, take-home messages here. There's lots of different ways that as your distribution system, if it is deteriorating, that deterioration could impact public health. And we like to think that rehabilitation and replacement of distribution system components can be treated as a public health issue in addition to a system reliability or a system efficiency issue. And so sanitary surveys, especially for this project, the distribution system part of sanitary surveys, are one of the tools that can help to identify and correct these infrastructure issues before they could become threats to public health. And so this is something for inspectors to, we hope inspectors are keeping in mind, but also systems being inspected, that these issues, like Lucio was showing pictures of earlier, these could have real impacts on the health of your water consumers. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.